Welcome to Inside the Set with SETDECOR, a series that focuses on the design and decor of the stories that excite us and ignite our imagination, where we discuss the collaboration between set decorators and production designers and hear first-hand accounts of how these works of art came to be, from their inception, ideas on a page, to completion, when we get to sit in the dark and experience them collectively.
Welcome to Inside the Set with SETDECOR. I'm Deslich, SDSA. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome set decorator Lauren Doss and production designer Sam Bader to discuss their beautiful and creative collaboration on The Testament of Anne Lee. Lauren and Sam, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. So first of all, Lauren, how did you come to work on the project and what appealed to you about it?
It was through a set decorator I'd worked with in the past who I think Sam had reached out to, looking for someone it was quite research based, sort of to help bring England to life a bit. And then it just kind of grew into this set decorator role, which Sam invited me onto the job and over to Budapest. And so, yeah, it all went from there, really.
What really drew you to it? Were you excited to work on a period piece? Was it the drama? Was it the story? Was it, working on an Amanda Seyfried movie? What was exciting to you about it?
Oh, several things. I think I've done a few period pieces, so I do really enjoy the historic aspect. And the Shakers, interestingly, I'd been to New York just like a few months before Sam had been in touch, and I bought a book about Shakers and shaker design. So the interest was already there, and not knowing the story of Anne Lee was really exciting to then find out, oh, this was started by a woman in Manchester, which was, at the time I was living in Sheffield, so it was really close to home, and it very much felt like a world I was still living in, because the buildings, are still around, some of them, and the Industrial Revolution is so prevalent in their recent history. It's very much part of the architecture still. So it just immediately I felt connected to it. And speaking with Sam and his excitement and his incredible research that he'd already done was just such a lovely chemistry to get involved with. And then when he introduced, Mona and the whole team, it was a really exciting creative project to be a part of.
And Sam, what about you? What was your process of coming to this project?
I came onto this project in January of 2024, about 6 months before we even started prepping the main unit, to help Mona and Andrew Morrison, the producer, kind of do this barn raising exercise, which was to go out to the Shaker Village and shoot a teaser with Amanda Seyfried. And Andrew Morrison had been a friend. I admired Mona's work greatly, but I'd never worked with her. And he approached me and said, would you be willing to kind of jump on this thing? We're going to, we need a designer. We're driving up on Friday. And so it was dead of winter, heavy snow, a lot of the that kind of round barn dancing stuff. We shot all of that. We shot a lot of that aerial footage, and a lot of the kind of softer, kind of more impressionistic portraits of Amanda in the real Shaker Village. But it was a rush, and I really wanted to read the script, and they sent it to me. And I know at the time they hadn't decided on a production designer for the main unit, and I saw it as, a dream job. So I read it and put together, what many designers do, which is a pretty extensive Bible that gets into every set. And, and Andrew had a good friend kind of helping me figure out what Mona really needed out of a designer on this project, and had wine and dinner with her and went through everything. And a few weeks later, she called me and said, so do you want to do this with us? And that was it. I was on a Zoom with Andrew, Josh, and the Hungarian producers the next day on a Monday, and was out in Budapest scouting pretty soon after that. And it was a huge leap for me, and I had never done anything that was sort of pre-photographic, deep period like this. I'd done a lot of 20th century period as a graphic designer, as a concept illustrator, and an art director. But yeah, I needed a really strong and knowledgeable creative partner, which I found in Lauren, which is somebody who had like the taste, the eye, and really understood not just the Manchester part, but I think, from having done Firebrand and Gallows Pole, I just knew you had done a lot of these like really intensive kind of uh, period pieces where the functionality of the spaces really was felt and really mattered. And so that was how I ultimately arrived at that. So
Lauren, what were your initial conversations like with the director? Did you have any sort of guiding visual principles that they gave you, any sort of like design and decor, like Northern Lights that you talked about early on?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mona is incredibly 360 the way she works. She's, a very visual person, and she's so knowledgeable as well. And she spent a lot of time working on this film, writing this film. So she was very knowledgeable about Anne Lee and the movement. And so there was a lot of references that came from her, visual references, and through Sam and her talking, and paintings and lighting and textures. And I think something that Mona was really in touch with was the textuality of how she wanted her sets to feel, and materials and fabrics, and just creating that mood through all these different elements.
There's a lot of texture in this movie, which is, important for a period piece, of course, but more so in this one. It is really lovely. Um, Sam, what about you? It sounds like you had such a short but like really good bonding process with the director early on. What were your initial design conversations like?
they were very siloed into the kind of like visual logic and sort of compositional logic of these, of Manchester, the New World, New York, and then ultimately Niskayuna, with the boat sort of being its own separate thing. We knew, I think one of yeah, it was a little shorter than it may have otherwise been, but the reality was we had between Mona, Will Rexer, the DP, and I, we had really like looked through my Bible, looked through Mona's notes and her references, and assembled, through kind of Artemis and Scout photos, like a really tightly constructed plan for what we were doing. And so no, visually, I think Manchester was William Hogarth all the way. I mean, we loved the cluttered, dense, messy, erectilinear, kind of muddled nature of that for England. And then, to use Mona's words, it's like then you're on the boat and it's wide open blue and it's seas and it's like a big horizontal line on a ship. And then you're in New York and it's freshly constructed, like you can almost smell the sawdust. And, for us, there's obviously like Francis Guy, who's a great American painter of New York at the time. But I think one of the other kind of serendipitous moments that told both Mona and I this was a good partnership was I love Hammershoy, the painter, and that was one of their big references for New York. Those kind of like washed out, more pale blues and kind of chalkier grays and earth tones. And then all of it does sort of build towards the utilitarian, very kind of in touch with nature feel of the Shaker village and seeing it be constructed and then, celebrated. So
The color palette in particular is very, very subtle, but very nuanced. There's just so many different shades of grays and browns and, like a million different browns in this movie. Was there sort of an overall, is there like a color arc throughout the film, or were there colors that were supposed to be more isolated towards certain areas of the movie?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would say so, wouldn't you, Sam? And it was, England in that period, it was very, it was slums, it was dark, it was repressed, it was, revolting. And Manchester at that time was going through the beginning of a revolution or pre-revolution. And Anne's background was pretty hard. It was pretty tough. It was pretty poor. And there is a lot of wool trade, so that you've got all these natural tones that automatically set you in England, and that was really important that we did have that color palette, but it wasn't just sort of dirge. We were able to have that nuance and define it with different sort of natural tones, and also work with costume on that as well. What kind of fabrics were they using, and what textures, and what, you know, like subtle patterns, way that we could bring in slightly elevated tones and interest, so it didn't sort of all just become flat brown. And I think that's part of the fun, isn't it, of just so often in period pieces you just do get these browns, these and hessians and things like that. So how you can bring a bit of nuance and freshness to that. And I think Mona was very particular about what she wanted to see and how she wanted to see it, which is really great to have that much direct input creatively in terms of the small details of fabrics and linens, and was very on board with that. So it definitely shifts from area to area, because you go from England over to America, and that new, like Sam was saying, that new color palette that's just freshly painted, everything's a bit brighter, and it's got that influence of all these different cultures coming from different countries that also have those palettes. And for example, you know, you go to Wales and you've got these blues and these reds, and they're translated over to America, and from Germany and from the Netherlands and Sweden. So you've got this lovely mixing pot of colour suddenly in America. It's kind of a slightly Wizard of Oz effect when you get there. It's all this opportunity, but yeah, it's still quite backwards. And so it's how we could use that to sort of do the arc of the story as well. But yeah, Sam was very much more leading with that. And I think the Shakers have such a specific colour palette too, that was really fun to work with, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. No, everything Lauren said is spot on. I'd say we knew that there was a kind of the big one of the big challenges with Manchester was like it is a lot of earth tones inherently. It is a lot of browns and darker kind of burgundy. So how do we and it's being shot on celluloid too, which naturally softens things and makes it kind of all fall off. So, you know, I think some of the work Lauren did, like in Abraham's Quarters, with the checkered um, checkered fabrics that we again, like I think, saw in a John Lewis. We saw, like, you know, there was always a question like, was this, because Mona's big thing, I'm jumping around a little bit because I compose my thoughts, so bear with me. You know, I think the Mona knew exactly what she wanted tonally, texturally, visually, but really leaned on us and relied upon us to be like, was this accurate? Was this real? Is there a precedent for it? It could even be more obscure than what the layman's vision of a 1750s Manchester is. But if we knew there was a precedent for it, we wanted to make sure we introduced it. So some more, you know, patterns that may not inherently be associated with that era, but were in fact around then. And then a lot with the paint finishes. I mean, I think with the Townley house in particular, you know, there's that, I think amidst all the earth tones and browns in Manchester, it felt like that olive kind of oil wash drab, like that really served as a nice kind of anchor for it. And you spent a lot of time in that set. And then some of those maroons and sort of warmer tones and burgundies, like what we saw in Williams Quarters. Like we wanted to, with Gosha, find some kind of richer, deeper, more lush colors that could kind of intersperse into what was like a very, you know, in fact, um, murky, cluttered environment just by virtue of how it was at that time. And then, yeah, New York, I mean, immediately when I read the script, I knew that kind of pale blue of the Hammershoy was like a major anchor for us, similar to Townley as like a kind of counterpart, that there's just like a washed out and kind of like sort of ethereal feel to those paintings, into that treatment. And then the work that, you know, Lauren brought to it with fresher feeling linens, and like William lighting through a lot of those window treatments when we're in the Cunningham house, for example. Like it does kind of like, without feeling too cinematic, like, well, it is cinematic, but without feeling too much like anything you've seen in a movie before, it feels like there's a rebirth there, which I think was very much the intention. And then, yeah, again, to echo Lauren, I mean, the shaker aesthetic is very well established. We did go through a ton of tests of like the trim color in all of the shaker buildings that we built because, we wanted to make sure that whatever we were putting behind Gosha's costumes really didn't compete or get too matchy matchy, as Mona likes to say. But there is, the best part of the shaker aesthetic is also the most challenging, which is that like there's a very well established kind of uniformity to it. So how do you preserve that and also acknowledge some of the kind of spatial and aesthetic considerations of making film sets? So
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that actually, because I think it's really interesting, Lauren, that you have a background as a researcher and, period pieces involve all of the design departments doing a lot of research already. And you were just so particularly suited for this because of your background there. Would you like to talk about all of the research that you did for this project?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I have a bit of a sort of obsessive nature when it comes to history. I sort of I'm quite compelled to just dig deeper and dig deeper. And I don't know if it's because also in my background, I'm half English, half American. So I've got this hybrid immigrant background that just wants to solve the roots of things. And I think it's such an interesting period in history that 18th century England, and it's something that when I was doing the gallows poll, it kind of got really inspired by, and also to like I think when it's a story such as Anne Lee, about a woman in that period. I've done in my own personal work a lot of research about women in history, and whose stories weren't necessarily told. And so it's to be able to sort of dig that out. And, I went to Manchester Cathedral. It was now a cathedral. It wasn't when she was baptized there back in the day. And, just speaking to them and learning about the church and where would she have been in position of where people would have stood, kind of said a lot about your class, which, England is obsessed with class. And it's fascinating. You sort of go back to the beginning and you kind of start to understand the story and the characters and where they came from. So it becomes not just like a research project, it just becomes more of an understanding of the story and the script and the people, and the performance aspect of it as well. So how you can bring that to the performers, to the artists, and make it real for them, so they can immediately understand the world that they are coming from. So I think that for me is really fascinating. It never stops being fascinating, and you, from job to job, get the luxury of researching all these different things that you would never normally get to do. And I think one area that we found particularly fascinating / challenging was the mill, and trying to find out, well, that period in time, it was pre-industrial, so you're working with your hands, and what was that like, and what actually was happening. And we really went down a big rabbit hole of what they would have been doing, how old were they, what would the children have been doing, how did they weave, what did they weave on. We went all around Europe, sort of virtually, didn't we, recently, getting in contact with museums that had certain looms and just trying to find out the crux of what in reality they would have been doing, and then see how close we can get to it. Because although we're telling a story with a musical and with amazing dancing, I think Mona did really want it to come from a historically accurate place. So we did our best to sort of get to the bottom of those things, which are, they're quite challenging sometimes.
I think it was fascinating, and so you did such a great job, and that's not really an era of industrial production that we see much on film. So it was really fascinating to see, like what that era of a mill would look like on the inside. And of course, your research supported it so well. And yeah, as you said, it's a musical, but it really needs that historical background to ground it really well. Yeah. Sam, what about you? What was your research process like?
Well, I want to. I'll get into that too, but I mean, Lauren, it's funny. It's like as we're talking, I'm looking through all our shared photo albums. I'm like, I got out there and was prepping and like meeting Mercedes, our Hungarian decorator, and starting to work with Shaba. And meanwhile, Lauren's in England. I mean, you went to Mason Mill, Crawford Mill, Strawberry Hill. Like the on the ground research and photographs were incredible and ended up having like, numerous little breadcrumbs that we found ourselves, you know, in our darkest hours referring back to when trying to do the Townleys and all of the all the things, the textile mills and workshops and homes as well. So I just wanted to like make sure that made it into this too, that like that on the ground research was incredible. And then yeah, we were talking to a lot of like historical loom and textile folks. My research process was extensive and kind of tireless. I jumped in and you know an older designer had once shown me that you should really always start at the picture collection at the New York Public Library's main building in Midtown. And I would go in with a scanner in my computer and just thumb through. It's a total anachronistic thing. Like no, like it's old Manila files that are cataloged with like probably over 1,000 different subjects. So I like to turn this spigot on as wide as it'll open and really ingest a lot of imagery and then talk to Mona, talk to Will, talk to Lauren, take a step back, and then start to distill it down to what really does work for us. All of the shaker drawings were hugely important. Both the drafting that they had done or that the federal government had really done of all their spaces in the 40s, that was hugely helpful. All the furniture drafting, but then the gift drawings and the spirit messages and all of the village views they had done. Like that was like you knew that like we had to really collect all of that in a relatively swift period of time. And then, you know, again, one of the things that drew me to this was that the challenge of a pre-photographic era. And so there was a visual and a textual component to my research. One thing that I helped Mona find the way to was, and Lauren touched on this as well, like it's a pre-industrial reality. And there weren't really, and I think Lauren, you probably turned us onto this, but like workshops, the way we think of them did not really exist. Like people, you had like 2 to 6 like kind of looms oftentimes in people's attics or upper floors. So in Mona, again, like she's very intuitive and she's fast. So the minute she clocks something like that, she goes, okay, well, then we pivot. And so it actually, I think, the challenge of achieving this degree of fidelity at this scale on this budget was such that like some of these creative realizations actually put us in a better place. Like to be able to embrace like uniform architecture of like the living reality of the Lees and these kind of several different textile spaces just yeah, I mean it made for a tighter, better, more kind of I don't know legible visually environment. And I do nerd out on like the verisimilitude and the historical accuracy of like no of like having like both like the exteriors with the matte paintings and these interiors feel very functional and presenting sets that even like a lay viewer with no context can really understand that like oh no, in fact you woke up, you gathered cotton, you gathered wool, you brought it back and you wove it or you loomed it.
I love that you mentioned that Mona is a very decisive director because when you're doing a period piece on a budget, that can be so important to have a very defined view of what you're going to try to accomplish and not try to accomplish too much the budget that can't support it.
She has as much a mind for that as any director I've ever met. And I will say I don't think we really produced much that wasn't photographed for this film or wasn't filmed it rather like everything was very additive. There wasn't a lot of backstepping. We never really like had to regroup. A few of those things, like the one I just mentioned, and the other one being more logistically driven, which was the Shattuck Mill, which was written as a Shattuck house. Again, I'm going way off book now, but like, you know, it became clear to make this film and give it the scope it deserved. Building a single family home in the woods and then burning it down was going to be like a ton of time of rigging and scaffolding and cranes, and then also the consideration of open flame in the dead of summer in Budapest, which had a forest fire watch. So the minute Mona clocked that, we sat and we were looking at like, frankly, the schedule and the budget, and it was like my art director Shaba was. Well, you could support it across, a pre-existing structure like a rock wall, and it would it would make it very doable. And I was like, that wouldn't be a house. That would be a labor camp of sorts, and there'd be a kind of mess hall and like foreman's office. And then we just started drawing it, and Lauren and I started working on what that kind of space would look like functionally. But yeah, again, for Mona, it was like a 30-second thing. It was like, oh no, we're absolutely, yeah. So that looseness and that confidence is I think, a huge piece of it from her and from, I mean, and our willingness to kind of engage in that way.
Yeah, that's so incredible from a director. Would you guys like to talk about the locations and sort of, choosing whether to build and then from Lauren's perspective, the difficulties of dressing a pre-existing location, especially like a sensitive historical location versus, working with a built set. Uh, what were your kind of directing principles on, like, whether to build or whether to dress an existing location for this movie?
I mean, we weighed up several options for the different sets, and with the Shaker settlements, it was kind of looking more like we're going to have to build it, which worked in our favor because it fits with the storyline. You've got people building a whole new settlement, and the aesthetic of the Shaker world is, it's very uniform, and it's very considered, and it's very sparse and spare, and it's very meditative. So I think that was a really lovely thing to be able to do. On the budget, it was difficult to do on the budget, honestly, because we're having to have things made. But we did have some kind of amazing strikes of luck, and I found a Shaker chair at a flea market, the one that Sam had sent me the reference for just that morning. We were quite lucky actually with some things that hit us, and then we could reproduce as much as we could within the budget, and that was a challenge in comparison to dressing the locations. And I think personally my experience of doing period productions has been a lot of dressing existing historical locations where you do have to be very, very careful of what you do and how you do it. The great thing about working in Budapest is we had a lot more flexibility with our locations, so we could really transform that space as much as we had the scope to do. And there are certain things that you have to compromise on just because you don't have the budget to change all the windows, or those door handles, or whatever it is. So you do have to just work within your limits sometimes. That's just the nature of the work. But all in, I think we were quite lucky with the locations that were chosen. We were really well chosen with Mona and Sam and Will and the rest of the team. And we kind of, like Sam was saying, we were quite specific about, well, how much can we see of this? How much can we afford to see of this? And how much can we afford to transform to really make it look like our world? And that was a lot of Sam's team being really resourceful and some compromise.
It was immensely challenging. I mean, and just from the outset, first time working in Hungary, first time working in Europe. But again, we had an amazing team, both like the art department and locations, and the art directors we brought on had been doing it. I mean, everyone's a Hungarian native, and so again, I'll bring him up. Csaba Lodi, our director, who's done numerous films there, just had a lot of ideas in his head and has good taste. And anyway, so at the outset, it was daunting. I mean, we didn't know, like, on paper, it's several interiors in New York, many interiors in Manchester. To Lauren's point, like the shaker thing was like always going to be constructed. It had to be because it's so specific. But the initial vision was to actually like do like much more in an arboretum and to have a kind of freestanding interior exterior meeting house with all of that scope and that roof structure. And I was fortunate to have had a background in art directing and budgeting builds. And so I kind of got very hands-on with that team very quickly, like in my first couple of pre-scouts out there, because I wanted to help us all get to the bottom of what we could and couldn't do so that the sort of goalposts were set for us and we weren't running budget scenarios and trying to figure out what was possible for the number we had to spend. And so we learned very quickly, kind of like I said with the Shattuck Mill, doing a full vaulted ceiling. I know some of us use meter, some of us use feet, like 120 foot by I think 35, 40 foot. Dance hall was just prohibitively timely to build and cost and expensive, just to be totally frank. So I'll speed this up. Our first full scout, we were looking at the best of the best of what we had, and we were seeing that like everything's spread out. So we had like an option for the Cunningham house, but it was it's on the Pest side, 30 minutes in that direction, and then we had and it kind of worked, but it needed a lot of work. And then we had two other options for the Townleys and then the Arboretum, and these were also spread out. And then to give him props, Csaba was like, these guys start speaking Hungarian, and then he kind of nodded. You're like, okay, cool. But there was an old 1840s estate called Brauch in a town called Brauch. It was Castelli Brauch. Sort of pseudo owned by the government, but also managed by like a private family. And we walked on there, and it was I mean, it was Mother Anne herself giving us a gift. No, it was like, okay, this 1840 structure, this totally works for the Townley house, and we're gonna kind of rip up all the wallpaper, we're gonna paint it, and again, like, to Lauren's point, like so often, yeah, there were certain moments where we couldn't do this with the camera, but a lot of these bigger set pieces were 360 dance spaces like the Townleys and the dance hall. So we needed to be able to open doors and see down hallways and do something quite expansive. So yeah, anyway, this one property gave us a beautiful 1840s, which is in spitting distance of the mid to late 18th century for us, and we made up the rest. But like we had the Townleys, we had the Cunninghams. They were literally like you open one door and you were in the you'd gone from Manchester to New York. And then there's a granary, again, like early 19th century with 3 stories, beautiful finishes, beautiful wood, and we knew that again narratively that functioned as the textile spaces and the Lee family home. And then you would walk out the door and look right, and you'd see a big wide clearing, and we knew that was the place on which to build the kind of shaker meeting house facade. And because we knew we had to shoot a lot of scenes, like the scene with Amanda, Thomason, and Lewis, like some of these meatier interior scenes, and we knew we needed some interior exterior relationship without, again, like just the time needed and the cost of building like a huge vaulted roof structure was a real hard and fast thing we had to solve for. So, at any rate, you have this facade finished, and then you have rooms finished inside, and those became sort of shaker satellite sets. And we did a kitchen, a workshop, a bedroom. I think probably some, for a lot of these, like, there were like 90 strips for some of these shaker scenes. So that was that. And then if that wasn't enough, you would go another 100 yards down the field, and there was this old, not even that old. I mean, no, it was like a somewhat contemporary concrete storage space, but it had a beautiful joists and vaulted ceiling. And we asked, can you knock out all the non-structure bearing walls? Can we literally build a set into this utilizing that structure? And again, it doesn't sound like something, it's not something people think about that often, but just the ability to have a freestanding, pre-existing thing that's doing the lifting for us in terms of support, coupled with a ceiling, just allowed us to build, yeah, a space that was as big as that space deserved to be, that could fit within the time frame and the budget. So, that was really like, if you look at it, percentage of minutes to movie, that is like, it's got to be damn near half the movie at least. I mean, of just that one location. And then, we had the backlots, which we painted and did a lot. And I think Lauren should speak to that because the work they did was incredible. And then a few other locations for the infirmary and for the prison, which was an old, I think early 19th century, like 1810s, 1820s fort. There's a great fort, which we, again, like the Hungarian producers kind of want to show you, like we know these are like some pieces you all will be ultimately using just because they've done this so much, like Vicky at Proton. Like, so there are certain things that we knew, but it was a real Rubik's Cube of how to solve for all this work. And that was the kind of gist of it. Yeah.
There's a lot of being creative and resourceful, I think, when you've got a budget like this and a film with the scope that this has. It was a lot of putting our heads together and trying to figure out how can we, and especially when you are working in Budapest, it's not England, it's not America. So it's really it is a challenge to how can like where do you put your resources into hiring which props that are really important to bring over so that you really have those English. For us, it was I brought a load of English Windsor back chairs because you just can't source certain things in Hungary. So it's an amazingly well structured industry there, but when it comes to certain things, when you're doing period pieces, it's quite challenging. So I think we had to be really smart about where we placed our budget, where we emphasized things and spent money on things that we couldn't have there, and how we could make cuts in other ways. And yeah, it was a lot of very resourceful plotting and planning, I think.
Yeah, and it sounds like you had a bit more freedom. You like, if Lauren, if you're used to filming in those like English National Trust houses where you can barely move anything at all, compared to working in these historical buildings in Hungary that maybe were giving you a bit more freedom.
But also you have to do a bit more because you have to transform it a bit more to make the ratio, the ratios of the spaces feel right. And so it swings and roundabouts really, I guess, with the locations. But really, I think we had some really great locations to work with, the best ones that we could have possibly found. I think we managed to find, it was touch and go at times as it normally is. It was a bit, but it was, yeah, I think we were really lucky with what we found, giving us so much that we could be resourceful with.
Absolutely. No, without a doubt. I don't think we could have done, there was no better location in that country to do what that main one did for us, I would say.
I wanted to talk to you too about the choreography, because that's something that you don't get a lot in a period piece, is having to work with choreography and having to integrate your work with working with a choreographer and planning for that and working around it. And I know that it, has some very specific influences on set decorating and designing. Lauren, what influence did the existence of the dance and the song elements in this movie, how did that influence your set decorating here?
I mean, I think it was actually one of the reasons I wanted to do this job as well, because I come from a bit of a dance background and I've worked with choreographers in the past. So it was really exciting to be able to do that on film in a period setting. But yeah, it did have its challenges. When it comes to the schedule, there's so much rehearsal involved. So you've got a lot more to work with when well, a lot less time to work with, shall we say, because it's really important for them to rehearse in that space and in that set. So it was challenging in terms of having as much time as we might usually do to dress the sets. It was less than, and also a lot more changeable. So, it was kind of like a moving set a lot, because you're kind of figuring out, well, this is the set, we've dressed it, but actually does that work with choreography? Because we didn't, on that budget, we didn't have the luxury of having that much time to rehearse in the set. So we just had to make it work for them and make sure it all slotted together. And in terms of flooring, you have to really consider the flooring that they're dancing on, and also the sound for the dancers, that the dancers are making, how that impacts. So softening the sound, and then the lighting, and we're periods, so it's all candles. So you do really have to think about that from a safety aspect as well. When you've got these big moving scenes, how can you, make it feel right, be safe, and also the right environment for them to work in. So yeah, it was a real learning curve for sure, but a good one. And Celia's movement is brilliant, and it's very free and expressive. So you've got big movements happening, it works perfectly in the shaker meetings, hall, which is why they designed it like that. And it all starts to make sense, doesn't it? You kind of go, oh yeah, okay, I understand now that we're able to sort of bring that to life, why they created these big spaces to move in freely, and why they have, these utilitarian chairs that could go up and be moved around. There's a lovely sort of simpatico between the repetition of, particularly of the shaker design, and the structures and the architecture and the detail and the rhythm of the movements, and start to see how it all kind of fits into their spirituality and their ideology. And that's a very unique thing to get to work with. You don't often get that. So yeah, it was a lovely thing to be able to work with that choreography.
Absolutely. I mean, it was one of the key most kind of considerations from the outset. The Shaker meeting hall does sort of explain itself in that, like, it's really about the kind of width and depth and height that allow for, we're not doing a Gene Kelly movie. No one's like heel clicking off of a shaker bench, which is good. But you do want that like compositional harmony, and you do want to make sure you give Celia and Mona the kind of volume of space to really achieve that scale of having fit. I think, whatever the number was, 60 some odd folks in there, moving in synchronicity. So yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think visually you can kind of look at that and take from it what we did. I think the ones that are a little subtler and are worth talking more about are like particularly the Townley, where again, I don't want to be a broken record and be like the constraints, but like, a movie that has this amount of resources usually, and is also period, it's usually, you can tell it's like we made a beautiful room and then that door's closed and that door's cracked and there's like a bench on the other side. But like, we wanted to be able, particularly the scene where the constables, or actually the Beatles as they were called, come in and rip Ann Lee out during, a miasmatic kind of dance. Like, you need to be able to move, like, you need so much implied scope to that. Like, that is basically a, 3/4 of what the whole home would be. So I think that having that fluidity between spaces within a home was hugely important. And, Lauren touched on a lot of this, but like any shooting schedule, we have to shoot a location in a block, and we have that set more than I think any other. It was like, there are the moments where it's very composed as a living domicile, as a living home that a couple lives in. So you feel the furniture, you feel the wall treatments and the dressing. And then there are the moments where you have dozens and dozens of people all gathered around, sharing, confessing their naughtiness. And then you have again, these kind of like miasmatic, shaking, quaking moments. And, the thing that I think Lauren and that team did incredibly well is just yeah, keeping up with that schedule and turning that set over like numerous times, sometimes twice in a day. And yeah, coming up with pretty, we had big chandeliers with 20 candles on them hanging, couple feet, a meter off of the dance, and people are being lifted. And so there's so much, again, like there was so much adaptability that we all had to have as we constructed this film together. I mean, yeah, it was endlessly exciting. And then, I mean, that's not the only one. I mean, the boat with Celia, where it's like, that's an 18th century recreation of a old schooner. I mean, there's no, and we had to, we built the most tight hugging covers and period stuff we could to make it feel like it's unimpeachably the 18th century. And I that was probably one moment where I was like, I can't. There's no more set to give. This is the bow of a ship. But again, Celia's it is so free flowing, and it again is so adaptive, and so all them kneeling and doing this. I mean, like I watching her and Mona figure that out. In a rehearsal day when it was shooting, like I don't know, a day or two after that was yeah, like hugely impressive. So
Let's actually, since you mentioned it, let's talk about the decoration and the design of the ship, particularly the hold space, because that is such a particular set with, your historical accuracy needs, but then also your filming needs. And that's a really interesting set that a lot of decorators don't get to do. I would love to know, what were your biggest struggles, and maybe the best parts about decorating and then also designing the ship, particularly that hold space that's so like cramped and crowded.
Well, actually, because that was shot mainly in Sweden on the 18th century boat. That was all the Swedish team that set decked that one. But we did build a stunt hold which had to flood, and that was quite a challenge actually to do that. Mainly just I think probably it was quite light touch from the set deck side, and the set deck team, the Hungarian set deck team, were great in sort of putting things together for that. But I think, yeah, I mean, for Sam and his team, that was a lot more challenging, the special effects.
a show that has, like a much larger footprint would go down, and we would fly over to Sweden, and we would source, and there would be like a prep time there. It really, just to be nakedly honest, was not the case. So, Lauren and I talked about the ship and harmonized around what it should look like. But at the end of the day, I mean, we had a great art director, and like it was a little different there. They didn't like there was no Swedish decorator per se, but they do a lot of ships in Jotunberg, which is a port town. And so, I think we did ship some props in a few. I want to say we shipped a few of the lights, that we liked, but really the hammocks, the seating, the side tables, the fabrics. It was all kind of sourced through our art director there, and then I was there to kind of oversee it. And so, yeah, that was the design of the ship. But even like, if you watch the top deck too, I mean, we cladded everything. We did complete cladding around the sides and the top of the stern, and brought on and like hoisted all the sails with all period sails, period hemp rope. The lifeboats that we rented were used again to kind of like really cover a lot and make it feel like it was a wide shot of an 18th century ship. And then you had animals, and then you had people, and then you had rain and Bob's your uncle.
I'm still yet to do the shit.
Amazing.
I can't tick that box.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I figured the upper deck was the location and the lower deck would have been the build, but I suppose not.
So it was the upper deck, and then the scenes in the hammocks were in Sweden. And then to Lauren's point, I think we shot sort of two scenes below deck, like in the second or third hold, where the bilge pump has like sprung and slats have come loose and the water's flooding in towards the end of that sequence. And those were in Backlot, Hungary, where we did a construction in set dress install into like an older wooden structure, which FX then like built a full drainage trough around and flooded for us because they were not keen on letting us flood their 18th century museum that was sitting on the water in Sweden.
Right, right. That makes sense. I wanted to jump back to something that we referenced when you were talking about, dancing around these chandeliers full of candles. I would love to talk about your interaction with the director of photography and how you managed lights in a period piece and practicals and things like that. And then also just your general working relationship with the DP, how that went for each of you. It's such a beautifully composed film. It has frames that, look like paintings, and the result was so beautiful. How was that working relationship with the DP for both of you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Will and Sam, the DOPs, were so obviously skilled and experienced, and shooting on film was great. I mean, it's the first time I've done anything on film, so particularly when you're doing a period piece and it is all, predominantly candles, but I think also that they wanted to sort of use as much natural light as possible, which was really nice to see. And some of the external, shots had no lights. It was all natural light. So, I mean, it is tricky with candle light and getting enough light, but I think we just kind of left them to sort of use as much as they wanted to and they needed to on each set, really, and try to allow for as much natural light to come through all the windows that we had as possible, and all the window treatments, tend to be quite thin because of that reason as well. So we could really utilize the shafts of light that would come through the barn of the Anne Lee home, and just to make it feel as sort of natural as possible.
Yeah, I'd say all that's certainly the case. I mean, yeah, Will is such, he's one of the most humble and experienced DPs I've ever worked with, and he's very approachable, and the collaboration is very natural. And again, we really knew Will, Mona, and I going as far back to when we were all just like in Brooklyn, frankly, looking at references and talking about the movie that we were doing something that was like explicitly, I mean, he brought some of the Czech and Italian new wave stuff, like All My Good Countrymen and Tree of the Wooden Clogs, and Mona loves, as do I, Tarkovsky and Andrei Rublev. So like there was a certain naturalism that was inherently going to be part of the look of this film, and that meant very little supplemental lighting, and only using supplemental lighting when it was motivated by something kind of narratively, based. And so. Yeah, I think we had our own candle team. Like if I recall, there was like two designated candle. We spent a ton of time on candles and the density and the wicks and just using candles and overly melted candles and shafts of wax and accumulation again, just to dirty up our sets in a way that felt real and not precious because I would say that even when we're in the shaker spaces and when we're in the Shattuck house towards the end of the film, like that was very important to us. Will and I, he shot Artemis photos of like pretty much every scene, the beginning shot, the kind of middle transitional shot in the end, and then, he would download them to us and I would pull them into, Procreate or Photoshop and draw and look with Lauren and look with Shaba and see, what we were seeing and what we weren't. And, everybody sings the praises of how important that is when they start making a film. And then sometimes people adhere to it more. Sometimes they kind of get busy and then that falls by the wayside. But I do think that like the extent to which we really utilize that kind of dynamic to make this film is something I'm pretty proud of.
I wanted to also jump back to working with the costume designer. You had both referenced working with her early on and talking about what sorts of fabrics and colors and fibers would be used and would be available to people, both for costumes and also for interior decor. And you also said something that I loved. I think Sam said it, that what people think is in period is not always what is actually in period. There's a lot of misconceptions about period decor and fabrics and what was like actually in period. What was your working relationship with the costume designer like? What sorts of conversations did you have with them, and how did they affect your decorating work on this film?
So we had a really great meeting at the very beginning of the film. We sort of all went over to the costume department. Mona, Sam, all of us sort of went over and just, it was a great opportunity to just share all of the references and all of the historical context, because it was so sort of quick to get into production. So the preparation time isn't always as long or sufficient as you'd like sometimes. So you just got to kind of make the most of those times that you're able to get together. And we had this great session of looking at all the costumes that Gosha had pulled together in a very short space of time with her team, and seeing, okay, well, where does that fit in, and what's the arc of the timeline of the development of the shaker outfits and costumes, and that was really helpful to me to sort of see that development, knowing that we go from England, but was predominantly wool-based textiles, because even though we are in an age of cotton, manufacture, it is poor people making cotton for wealthy people to be sold, to the wealthiest. So you've got this division that you really need to try to work with of using those fabrics to tell a story through the costumes and through the soft dressings that we're doing. So that was really great. We spent quite a portion of that day just going through the color palettes and how it relates to the characters and where that puts us in each set. And then I think we spent time sort of, there wasn't too much opportunity for much more conversation when we were filming. So we sort of had to grasp those moments that we could, of going, showing each other textiles that we wanted to use for the shaker dressings and the rugs and the bedding and the colours that were coming through for the shakers, and what Mona, I think, had decided on. And I think Mona was really she was really the sort of center point that we could go to, because she really held all of that in her mind all the time. It was so we could always bounce things off her, which was such a luxury to be able to do that with a director. So yeah, we tried as much as we could to sort of keep that conversation going through the film, and keep it sort of coherent, I suppose.
Matt, I think that first long, we took a whole like over half a day in the costume department. Lauren, Mona, Will, myself, looking through everything. I mean, Gosha's a force. She'd pulled so much stuff, had done a ton of her own research. I had again had more time, more soft prep. Had built like lots and lots of folders, and she and I were sharing references quite often. And Lauren's correct. It was like that was the big moment to really talk through most everything, and the rest was a bit more fly by the seat of your pants. I mean, we were looking at, for sure, the shaker stuff. It was like the shakers and the Townleys, because it's so many bodies in these spaces, and we want to make sure compositionally and tonally there is like this, like that there's a nice variance in hue and in kind of brilliance of each color, so that it doesn't really muddle together. Like we spent a ton of time on that. And we spent a ton of time with her and the scenic team and Shaba and I on paint finishes. Again, for really those two more than any other. But yeah, I mean, she built a lot of costumes. I mean, it was really kind of unbelievable what she was able to do, and with that team. But yeah, I'd say she also comes from she researches with the best of them and brought a ton of ideas to it as well. Yeah.
And I think it was quite important um, with Mona and Gosha, and what came through was actually sort of creating our sort of own identity with these costumes and with these fabrics. And so it was, there was an element of we could create something that was a bit unique, because we didn't exactly know precisely what Annie was wearing at that time, and how her fashion sense had changed. And so there was the opportunity to sort of create a bespoke look for the film, which was a nice creative license to have in terms of our color palette and our fabric choices.
Wonderful. Yeah, let's take a look at some images from the film.
Manchester streets we've got here, with sort of Anne Lee family home.
This is at one of the backlots, Goblyarish, about an hour outside of Hungary. This is, as Lauren said, the Lee family home. Because it's less densely packed architecturally, we were making it as our kind of outskirts of Manchester, and then later on in the film, you do feel like a more developed inner Manchester. But yeah.
Lauren, what is it like decorating one of these backlots to a particular period?
It's quite challenging in a way. I mean, yeah, it's I think it's trying to bring as much life to it as possible. So it really helped, all the actors, giving them as much action props and activity to do as possible is what really sort of brings these backlots to life, because obviously they're already there in existence and there's not so much that you can change about them. It's sort of you can only do certain superficial things, and it's a lot about the dressing. And I think we just leaned into the fact that Manchester was still quite pastoral pre-industrial revolution, so it was it was quite like this at that point, and until you sort of, like Sam was saying, get to the more in the central area where they had a few more modern buildings that look a bit more like what we think of as Georgian stone buildings. So yeah, I think it was really important bringing the animals, bringing the vehicles in, like just giving that sense of life.
Totally. And, what you can't see from this image is that, to Lauren's point, we really feel this mostly in a matte painting wide, where we have, for example, like we knew we weren't doing straw roofs. We were out of that era. We were into something that was modernizing. So, we don't have the image here per se, but, if you see the matte painting wide shot of this, you get the kind of like Christchurch roof line and some of those stone structures in the background. And again, it does help kind of orient you, the viewer, to where you are in this, fictitious city, or this kind of narratively constructed city.
And Lauren, I know one of the challenges as a decorator when you're working on a backlot is just the scale of the amount of set dressing needed. There's just so much of it that it requires. It's, the equivalent of like several houses worth of set dressing per block, usually.
Yeah, it can just swallow dressing up. Absolutely. And when you're on a smaller sized budget, you just have to keep moving things around and trying to, reinvent areas that create vignettes and those moments with the actors that are there. And yeah.
So that's the what I was talking about, that Celia had to make a full dance number into. Yeah, I mean, you'll see that it's cladded. If you look along the kind of why can't I think of what you would call this? The kind of a banister line, for lack of a better term. We cladded everything. It was all open netting, but that camera, you're in a you're in a 2024 Sweden there, so everything had to be kind of low or here. If you were to flip this camera around, you'd see some beautiful sails that we shot into a ton. But for all that top deck sequence, for all the scenes in that top deck sequence, we were utilizing the actual architecture of the ship. What you see, some of these storage jut outs with all the rope. I mean, that was all built to be masking, and that's what that is.
The matte painting, I think this is really great that you used a old Hollywood practical effect in this movie.
I mean, this was one of the, you know, it's hard to pick your favorites, but like working with him on this was incredible. And then to get through an assembly and like see what Mona was liking, what she wasn't liking, what was in front of the camera, what wasn't, how much we moved through, again, those backlots in particular, where we want to explain, we want to kind of create compositions that help anchor the viewer in where they are in the part of the movie. So you can see he has our plate taped to the bottom left, and a few references, it looks like, from Christ Church, and some, sure if you were to lift that sheet up, you'd see a lot of great watercolors and paintings of Manchester at the time. Yeah, and he's shooting on board. He's painting on board. Just, we had a few meetings with different matte painters, some of whom were more rigid than others about how you should do it. But he was, again, I just want to throw out Lee Took, Matson Miniatures, who's incredible. And he was very fluid, like everybody else who helped make this movie, with what worked best. And doing it in studio on board as opposed to like glass in plein air was the way we wanted to do it. And then really, like, it's an old analog technique that once you've painted it and we've worked out the composition with my like Photoshop illustrations and his paintings, then it can really be used like a digital asset. It just has a handmade quality to it that I think a lot of movies chase with digital and don't ever really find. So
Static house. I'm just going inside in my mind. Lots of candles, wasn't it? Lots of candles here. I think most of the dressing was actually made. We brought in a few benches because the space was supposed to be sort of impromptu meeting hall that, they've been driven out to. This is the only place that they could gather at this point. So it's quite a volatile environment.
Would you like to talk a little about the fabrication of furniture and set dressing items that you had to have done for this movie? Did you have to do quite a bit of that for this film?
Yeah, we did, because of the nature of it being shaker, quite simply, and so specific, and it was all about the details. So we did, yeah. I mean, I sourced an original shaker chair that we then had replicated by some brilliant makers in Hungary, and then we sort of looked at what else we wanted to manufacture for which sets, and looked at also sourcing. Hungary's amazing for carpentry and wooden furniture, so we found some amazing antiques hangers that had a lot of furniture that we went through and saw, what could I see the bones of shaker pieces that we could maybe alter to have some made not quite from scratch, because the fabrication in itself was very expensive to do. So with the restraints on the budget, we had to sort of find other ways around, to create those rooms, like the Mother Anne's bedroom and the sort of kitchen, laundry room, and then the workshop, and just how we could transform the spaces with those pieces. So we had some beds made and some other sort of facades of furniture made, which Sam had designed based on I think they were the original drawings, weren't they, Sam? Do you want to jump in?
chairs and the beds we had, yeah, original drafting, which again we like tweaked here and there for actor size and things like that. But there's no, I mean,
You found some amazing original drafting drawings of those pieces, didn't you?
There's a whole book at the public library. It took like 400. It was like, okay, it was like right at the outset. It's like we don't know it's way too early to know what we're doing, but I'm just going to literally like scan this entire book because we knew and we used a ton of it. I mean, even for like the candle holders that go in the pegs, the beds, the chairs. Those are the big ones that your team did an amazing job producing. I mean, we ended up construction made a lot of the built-in cabinets, which look gorgeous.
I mean, it's such a wealth of design to work from that you're kind of challenged to sort of look at the period that you're in. And because we were at the beginning of the Shaker settlement when they first were beginning, so we looked at sort of the influences as well of what contributed to their designs and kind of built that through the film, so bringing those elements in so that when you get to the Shaker settlement, it all kind of visually makes sense without you really being conscious of it. And then picking those designs that were, as close as we could get to the period that we were in, which is just such a luxury to be able to do.
That's wonderful that you were able to find so much primary resources about, furniture pieces that are, 300, 400 years old at this point. That's incredible. So what would you say would be your biggest challenges on this project? And then conversely, what were your greatest pleasures or the things that brought you the most satisfaction here, Lauren? Overall on this film, what would you say those were?
I mean, I think challenge-wise, I think that the sourcing, certain specific, it's so specific what we were doing and the period and the place so I think sourcing certain things was quite a challenge. Certain fabrics and certain pieces of furniture on the budget, I think was quite challenging, and also within the time frame that we had, it was such a quick pace. So yeah, I would say that was the main challenge. But what was also the blessing was having such an amazing creative team that we could problem solve, rather than just have to deliver. Working with Mona was such a kind of flexible thing, and although she's very specific about what she likes and she's decisive, that can really help you. And if you have to change things, then you know what direction you have to go in. And I think working with Sam, we were both feeling this out together. We were both problem solving together, and it was a great journey to go on and really have to stretch your creativity in a different country, something that I've not done before, and have the luxury of Hungary's got such amazing craftspeople. It really was like you had access to a lot of great people who could manufacture things and so hardworking, and I think that was definitely a highlight for sure.
I think the challenge of getting all this right, given the pace, was the most daunting part of this. And Lauren, more so than anybody else, as like a creative partner to help figure that out, was like how and why this movie looks the way it does. I mean, really, I don't have a better answer than what Lauren gave for the greatest joy. I will say, it's I echo it entirely. I mean, it's the team we had, it's the fabricators. I mean, I've done a lot of construction and scenic work in the States, and those people are brilliant and I love them, but the speed with which they can build is very is I was totally shocked by it. And the scenics, the sculptors, the set deck fabricators, were all brilliant. Like for a more anecdotal answer, I will say that like we've like perfecting the shaker aesthetic took time and resources, and that Shattuck mill that burns down at the end was a set that we had to keep kind of borrowing from, and there was this counterintuitive, like the more we cut time and resources out of the Shattuck mill, the more brilliant it became because it became about finding salvaged barnwood and hobbling it all together, and it wanted to be like a very foreboding and daunting and unsettling kind of set in moment in the movie where these people kind of go into the husk of this old wooden structure and get assaulted and beaten. And so I think I kind of evoke that because somehow when you really put that team in a corner and had to, where we had to really think about how the hell do you do this, without tons of time of scenics and carpenters. They, coupled with a great set designer, Kata Compagnier, who's just draws beautifully and then goes and art directs. Watching that set come together, I think, in addition to the team was a real joy because we gave them a lot of research and it was 2 hours away from everything else. And so you couldn't be there every single day. And yet it just sort of like evolved so beautifully. Yeah.
How did SDSA business members support you on this film and for what sets? Were there any particular vendors that you'd like to give a shout out to?
Well, because we were in Hungary, we used a lot of Hungarian suppliers and some English ones. Sam could probably shed more light on that than I could, I'm afraid.
We hired from a guy named Scott Pinprezi out in historic Eastfield Village for a lot of the props. I think I have to give a shout out to Local 52 member Sandy Hamilton, prop master, who helped with the sourcing of a lot of the stuff for the US unit. Yeah, and then we were, I mean, not to take Seam out of the question, we were in the Shaker Village. So we fabricated some more stuff over here for that, and we utilized a lot of the existing Shaker, period accurate furniture for that. Sandy has a huge storage in Red Hook of everything he's collected, and he was nice enough to open his doors to us for me to come visit with him and take out some felling axes, some squaring axes, a few draw knives, a two-man saw for tree felling. Yeah, I think historic like Scott Pinprezi's an old film historian who is a caretaker at an old historic village up in Chatham. So that was the main place. I don't know that I'm not sure if he's SDSA affiliated or not.
Well, this has been lovely. Thank you so much for going into the background of the film with us today. I loved learning about The Testament of Anne Lee and all of your amazing work on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Inside the Set with SETDECOR. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website, SETDECOR.com.